So, hey, David, thank you for agreeing to speak with me. Let's start with what it is you do and how you got into that field.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. Well, I'm a specialist in applied geophysics, particularly seismic reflection techniques, which are what is used by the oil industry in exploring for oil. And when I was at the British Geological Survey for about 14 years, I did work closely with the then Department of Energy, and we were concerned with the early days of exploration in the North Sea and west of Britain. When I moved to Glasgow University as a new professor of geophysics in 1987, I moved to doing onshore geophysics. And then they shut our department in 1988 and I took early retirement. And after that, I did a little bit of oil industry consulting on the side, just part-time, and including working for the Indian government on their oil exploration prospects. But about 2010 or so, or 2011, I decided I shouldn't really be exploring for new oil because of the climate implications. So I gave it up. And it was about that time, coincidentally, that fracking came on the radar. And I hardly knew what fracking was.
Could you outline kind of briefly for the layman, what is fracking and why is it particularly controversial and risky?
Yeah. So first of all, you drill a vertical well, then you run it horizontally, you turn it over a radius of several hundred meters. It's all big scale. You turn it horizontally to run along the shale layer that you want to attack. You put your steel tubing down, you shove it down section by section to the far end of the well. Then you pierce through that by little explosive devices. So you fracture the tubing every few meters. Then you pump down the water mixed with sand under very high pressure indeed, which passes through the holes you've made in the tubing and starts to crack up the shale, which would otherwise be very tight. Tight is a word used in the oil industry, meaning very, very low permeability. So what you're doing is permanently altering the characteristics of the shale to make the oil or gas in it flow easily. Then, once you finish doing the fracking, which can extend for tens of meters or hundreds of meters above and below the well, which is now running horizontally, remember, you then start extracting the oil or gas. So fracking is controversial because it alters the rock underground in a permanent manner with the aim of increasing its permeability, that is the ability for fluids to flow through it. And as a byproduct of that, because you've kind of opened up the rock under the ground to extract the oil or gas, you also create pathways for pollution from the same oil or gas or from the chemicals that you've put into the ground to do the fracking, and to allow the pollution to come up through faults and pre-existing pathways like that, to contaminate groundwater near the surface and thereby pollute your drinking water supplies. But the danger is once you've contaminated a groundwater source, there's no easy cure for it. You've wrecked an environmental resource potentially forever. Now, these concerns are dismissed by the oil industry and by their academic friends in the universities. They say, oh, there's a safe distance between the depth at which we're fracking and the shallow, geologically speaking, groundwater supplies in the layers of rock near the surface. But this is always an oversimplification, because there always are pathways from depth up to the surface, not least the drilling of the wells themselves. These are pathways. And for all that the industry goes on about the safe drilling and the casing, which is the steel tubing, once they've drilled the hole, they shove a tube down and then they cement it up on the outside. You know, they say all this is, you know, very safe and there's no risk of any pollution, but that's complete nonsense as well. Because all wells leak in the long term. There's no such thing as a safe and sound 100% secure oil well. They all leak, whether from day one or after 50 years. Because not least the steel tubing starts to rust. And in particular, the cement on the outside of the steel tubing, next to the rock, where there's a gap, and they've pumped a slurry of cement in. That is rarely 100% effective. And the cement starts to rot and get shifted by natural forces like earthquakes and tremors. So around the outside of the tubing, you get a pathway from where you've fracked up to the surface. So in effect, there's no such thing as safe fracking if you're messing about with Mother Nature down at 2 kilometers depth, where you're fracking the rock and the near surface water supplies. Now, in America, all this got going in about 2005, 2007, and it became a big industry by 2010. And that's where the little cowboy companies in England picked up on this. Oh, this sounds like a good way of making money. Let's get into fracking. So companies like Quadrilla came along, got a license at Balcombe. That was the first one. So they denied they were going to frack at Balcombe, but then they admitted they were going to apply acidization, which is the ugly sister of fracking, where instead of applying a sand and water mix under very high pressure, you put in very strong hydrochloric acid to dissolve limestone layers, which you then create the voids from which you can then collect the oil or gas. So while fracking no longer has the support of the UK government, this was the last statement by one of the ministers in charge a month or two ago, the ugly sister called acidization is still permitted. And this is now the main problem in the wells at Horse Hill and possibly also at Brockham, both in Surrey. They say they're not going to frack, but they do say they're going to acidize by drilling along so-called limestone layers in the Kimmeridge Shale. The latest plans by UCOG, which are currently being considered by the Environment Agency, and I think by Surrey County Council, are to convert an existing horizontal well, which they drilled a couple of years ago, make it into a re-injection well, where they take the waste brine from what they've produced at Horse Hill and elsewhere in the Weald, and they pump it down into this well, which was a failure as an oil well. So they're now going to convert it into a re-injection well to get rid of this nasty polluting brine. Now, the bad thing about this, re-injection is a normal process in the oil industry because you create lots of brine that comes up with the oil. So you separate the two off, you take the oil away in tankers or pipelines, and then you're left with this brine, which you then put back into the ground. The trouble with Horse Hill is the depth at which all this is going to happen is extremely shallow, and you're only a couple of 100 meters below the valuable, clean groundwater resources of the Weald. So there's a great danger there that doing this re-injection, you could contaminate the groundwater in that area. Mm-hmm. And they're not only going to re-inject what they will produce at Horse Hill, they're going to import it by the lorry load from all over the Weald and use Horse Hill as a kind of dumping ground for re-injection of dirty, polluting, produced water, as it's called. That's the technical phrase. They're going to re-inject all that into the Horse Hill re-injection well. And injection is part of a normal process of oil production, where you are normally allowed to pump the brine that you've produced along with the oil back down into the same formation, the same geological layer that you got the oil out of. That's twofold. First of all, you get rid of the brine that you don't want and there's no value. And secondly, it pumps up the oil field a little bit. You know, it increases the pressure in the oil field, which helps the flow back up of the oil that you want.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a normal process. But the danger at Horse Hill is it's extraordinarily shallow. It's only about 620 meters depth. Whereas oil fields are normally at 2 or 3 kilometers depth, you know, 3 times the depth. So there's a concomitantly greater danger of damaging the groundwater resources up nearer the surface. Now, UCOG, UK Oil and Gas, denies that there's any risk to groundwater and that the groundwater resources in this area are very poor anyway. But that's not true. They're telling lies. There is a good groundwater layer above where they're proposing to do the re-injection. Now, apart from all that, the spanner in the works, which certainly happened at in the Fylde in Lancashire, is of course the triggering of earthquakes. So on the 1st of April 2018, you probably know about it, there was a sudden earthquake affecting thousands of residents in Surrey and causing a lot of material damage. Came out of the blue in an area where earthquakes are in effect unknown. And of course, the first suspect you think of is the drilling either at Brockham or at Horse Hill. Is that somehow behind the sudden triggering of a swarm of earthquakes? By a swarm, we mean when you have one earthquake and then another and another in close succession in the same area. So you can plot them on a map like a cloud. And they're all 2 to 4 kilometers southwest of Horse Hill. And they're about 7 kilometers away from Brockham. So the Oil and Gas Authority, who are one of these incompetent authorities supposed to regulate the industry, along with the Environment Agency and Health and Safety Executive, they called a one-day meeting of scientists and the industry in London in October 2018 to discuss the problem of earthquake triggering. So there were some seismologists there who are competent guys, who do research in earthquakes. And there was the industry, of course, defending its position. And then supposedly neutral, there was the British Geological Survey and the Oil and Gas Authority. So they had this one-day meeting in October 2018, and they decided by a majority opinion that the earthquakes triggered at Newdigate, southwest of Horse Hill, had nothing to do with the nearby oil activity at Horse Hill. But this was misleading because at the time, on the day of this meeting, the participants, apart from UCOG, didn't know that in fact UCOG had been active on the Horse Hill site in the week before the earthquake triggering started. And this is a very important point. So they withheld valuable information, which misled the seismologists, for example, like Stephen Hicks, who was at Southampton University, he's now at Imperial College. He was in effect misled into accepting the majority opinion that the earthquake triggering was just natural, albeit rather sudden and out of the blue. The one dissenting voice in all this at this meeting was Stuart Hazeldine, who's a professor at Edinburgh University and a former colleague of mine at Glasgow. He pointed out that there was a mechanism whereby activity at the Horse Hill site could lead indirectly and after a delay of a few days to triggering of earthquakes on a fault nearby. but he was sort of outvoted, although his views were taken into account. The main reason being that on that day, of course, none of the participants knew that UCOG had actually been on site at Horse Hill. So the story was nothing was happening. You know, nothing had happened at Horse Hill for 2 years. The well had been shut down, which means they close all the valves, and you just leave it. And UCOG claimed that they first came on site and presumably opened one or more of the valves, holding the well tightly shut, just like a tap. And they came on site on, I think it was the 7th of April or the 8th of April. In other words, they started interfering with the well a week after the earthquakes started, so they can't be held responsible. But the story is more complicated than that, because they were on site in the week before the earthquakes were triggered, starting 1st of April. They were on site on the 21st, 22nd of March. They weren't actually touching the wellhead itself of the existing well, so that was held tight. But I've looked into this in a bit more detail, and what I've shown, and from some great drone footage taken by some of the protesters at Horse Hill, they don't tell me who it is, they want it secret. Might be you for all I know. But the footage, the great thing is the footage shows, along with the plans of the well site, that on the week before the earthquake started, UCOG were on site digging a new well cellar, it's called. This is a 2-meter deep hole in the ground, 6 meters from the original wellhead, which is a concrete cellar. You know, it's circular in cross section. It's 2 meters deep, and all your valve gear is in this cellar, which of course is all lined with concrete. And then you put a building over the top of it to keep the rain out. So they were messing around with a digger, which weighs between 6 and 8 tons, a JCB, digging a new well cellar 6 meters away from the original wellhead. So you've got a heavy digger, and they removed 20 tons of material, you know, of wheeled clay. So they were messing around, driving around the original wellhead with a digger, excavating a new well cellar. And that, in my view, is enough of a disturbance of the wellhead, of the existing wellhead, to allow cracks to develop up the outside of the cement casing. And then after a few days, you know, you've released the pressure, not suddenly, not like popping a champagne cork, but over a few days, you release the pressure. No one knows, because it's a slow process. So the activity, the point is the activity of the JCB on site is more than sufficient because of the weight of the JCB and the earth it's taking away and driving around just next to the existing well cellar, would be enough to disturb the very top part of the existing wellhead, fracture the cement casing ever so slightly, release the built-up pressure that's built up over 2 years. And then that release of pressure percolates through and triggers the earthquakes at Newdigate, 2 kilometers away. This accounts for when they did open up the well valve a week after the earthquake started. There was no excess pressure, which is abnormal, because the normal process is you have a build-up of pressure, which you then release. So the fact that they found no pressure, and they've admitted this, is, you know, counts against them. But to go forward from this story, UCOG, or its development company, Horse Hill Developments Limited, HHDL, is currently applying for permission to convert the existing Horse Hill number 2 into the injection well, where they will force down brine and pump it into the the existing layer of Portland sandstone, to get rid of the brine. But it's well known in the industry, in fact, it's a normal process, that when you pump water into an injection well or brine, and you trigger earthquakes. So even if you believe the story, which is now, I think, doesn't hold water, that the Newdigate earthquake swarm of 2018-19 was not related to the activities at Horse Hill, then you can almost be sure that if they start injecting water into the existing Horse Hill failed exploration well, using it as an injection well, you will trigger earthquakes.
Mm-hmm.
So on the grounds of the pollution of water supplies and the triggering of earthquakes, the Environment Agency really should refuse its approval for any future activity at Horse Hill.
What about at the global level in terms of climate change? Like, obviously we know that burning carbon emissions increases, the effects of climate change. But what about specifically at Horse Hill with the kind of exploration that's going on there?
Well, the claim is we will be producing indigenous oil, which will be used in Britain, and this will save on imports. It will save the shipping costs and the pollution that causes by importing foreign oil or gas. It's oil at Horse Hill, by the way, not gas. So that's their claim, and that we still need oil and gas while we transition towards a zero carbon future. But the fact is, without Horse Hill or any other onshore, or for that matter, offshore oil fields in the UK, we have enough oil supplies to see us out while we transition more rapidly towards zero carbon forms of energy. But I mean, we have to be out of producing oil and gas in the next 5 years, I would say. And we certainly should not be allowing any future exploration for new oil resources or production, which is in effect what Horse Hill is. And there's an oil field west of Shetland, which has long been in the development stage, but hanging fire, which apparently is going to get permission for development offshore west of Shetland, just before COP26 in Glasgow, which will be sending a terrible signal to the rest of the world that Britain is just not serious about stopping its own oil and gas production. And another byproduct of oil production, particularly from onshore shale wells, which fortunately has not happened in Britain, is the production of methane from leaking wells. And methane is a far worse problem for the climate as a greenhouse gas than is carbon dioxide, although it doesn't last so long because it breaks down into CO2 and water after 25 or 50 years. But in the short term, it's a much more serious greenhouse gas. And producing methane as a byproduct of oil and gas production is a very serious problem, even more serious than just burning the oil and gas itself. So we have to act urgently on that. The problem of leaking methane, and methane even being flared off, especially in the US. They want the oil, they just flare off the gas because they can't be bothered building the pipelines to collect it. So it's a pretty disgusting problem.
What's the one thing you would like to see change at a kind of national level in terms of this approach to it?
Very simple. At the national level, there should be good subsidies for everyone to get rid of their gas-fired boilers and install heat pumps. I'm a great believer in heat pumps. Whether it's air to water, that is, you suck the heat out of the air, the big fan mounted in the big box on the side of your house, looks like an aircon unit. Take the energy, the free energy from the air, and you compress it, literally with a compressor inside the heat pump, and you pump the hot, you put it into hot water, which then flows through your rads. So you keep your existing rads, but instead of heating them with a gas-fired boiler, you heat them with a heat pump. So I think there should be subsidies, like there used to be for installing gas-fired boilers, in fact. There should be subsidies in Britain to help people convert gas-fired boilers to heat pumps. And at the same time, installation of new gas-fired boilers should be banned. Solar panels do work in Britain, and of course, at the national scale in Britain, offshore wind turbines are now the future, because of the economies of scale, and you can put them out of sight on Dogger Bank or in the Irish Sea or in the English Channel. You can have vast fields of wind turbines, producing vast amounts of electricity, and they're out of sight of people. So there's no local sort of NIMBY style objections, and they work best at the big scale anyway. On the positive side, I think we're winning the battle against fracking and acidization. And I wrote a paper with Ada Zafina of Brockham Oil Watch and with a lawyer from London. The three of us wrote a paper, a policy paper, published in a journal called Energy Policy, showing how acidization is really a form of fracking. If you take fracking in the broad sense of permanently altering the rock under the ground to get more oil and gas out, then acidization is just a form of fracking. And the UK legal definitions and policy around fracking and acidization are all incoherent. They're a complete mess. They're mutually contradictory. And what the government should adopt is our new definition of what stimulation of rocks comprises. And of course, this should be extended to a ban on acidization as well as on fracking. So that would be a particular benefit to you guys in Surrey and Sussex.
Amazing.
But
well, listen,
we're winning the battle. We've won the battle against shale fracking in Lancashire. Now, only a couple of days ago, I got an email from a lawyer in London who says he's representing a group of investors who want to take action against an unspecified UK oil company for misleading them in their investments, and by producing overhyped predictions of how much wealth will be created, and of course all the investors would get rich quick. Well, to be honest, I've little sympathy for them. It's just a failure of capitalism. Okay, pal, you've invested money in something stupid. You've lost your money. I did have a phone call with a guy a few months ago who said he was representing people, and he blabbed about, oh, I've got a friend who lost all his life savings. He invested it in I won't name the company, but he invested it in one particular nasty oil and gas company, and he's lost all his life savings. Well, I could be sort of sympathetic. Why should I go out of my way to help these guys? They caused the problem. And they're just a symptom of capitalism. Sucks in the mugs to throw their money at Ponzi schemes and useless projects. The CEOs of all these companies walk away with millions. So that's how it works. The CEOs get rich no matter what. And it's investors who lose out in the long run. Of course, the biggest failure of capitalism is it can't deal with the climate crisis.
Yeah.
It's congenitally impossible for capitalism to get to grips with such a problem, because it requires national and international action.
Yeah.
Where you have to introduce new laws to stop companies doing things which they will otherwise do and get away with. The essence of capitalism is to make money while you pass on your costs to externalities. You pass them on to third parties or to society at large while you get rich.
Yeah.
and the climate and the world can't cope with that anymore. I'm going to be dead in 20 years, I guess, or sooner. I'm 74 now. But it's you younger guys and children, you're going to have to try and live through this. It's appalling.
I just want to say thank you. I really appreciate it again. Like it's been really interesting hearing at kind of the detailed level what's going on and how it all happens and how it works. Thank you so much. And
well, thank you for doing the cycle ride, and I hope you've raised. I suppose I should kick in something to your pot. Yeah.
If you can, that would be great.
Yeah.
Much appreciated.
Okay, Simon. Nice talking to you.